Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues joining online. We might wait a few more minutes before we get started as people keep coming into the room here in Geneva. Okay, let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, colleagues here in Geneva. Good morning to those calling in from somewhere else. And good evening to those probably close to Asia tonight. Welcome. My name is Bridget Hancock. I work for UNHCR Field Security Service. And today I'll be moderating this conversation on hostage taking in humanitarian environments. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I want to take a moment to kind of frame this conversation and to set out the kind of discussion we're going to have today and why. Let me start by saying something that we think as a panel needs to be said explicitly. Hostage taking is one of the worst crimes that we see people inflict on one another. It is horrific in nature. It has a deeply traumatic effect on everybody it touches. The individuals directly involved, their families, their colleagues, first responders, and the organizations. And the impact doesn't end when the incident ends. And so before we go any further, we really wanted to collectively acknowledge that as a panel today. Because this conversation carries such weight, it's a complex issue and it's emotionally charged. And so some of us may feel emotions as we're talking about this conversation, and we're conscious to try and navigate this conversation with a little bit of care. We're going to focus today on cross-organizational sharing. We're going to focus on learning and the broader prevention and response mechanisms of hostage taking. And we're hoping that this first time we're having this conversation at HNPW, we'll have many more conversations, but we're hoping to take this first one a little slowly and talk more broadly. Give you a bit of a sense of the landscape, some of the gaps that we're seeing, some of the things that we think the sector have done well, and some things that we think we need to do more of. With that in mind, I want to set out some specific boundaries for the conversation due to the nature of the conversation. Firstly, we will not be discussing specific cases or incidents or any operational details of any current or past cases of hostage taking involving humanitarians. I'm sure you can understand why, but it's important for the ongoing safety of them and also their families. Where questions touch on areas that are too sensitive for us to discuss in a public forum, we'll just say that and we'll move on. But please feel free to ask us questions as we go. Just be patient with us as we try and navigate kind of the sensitivities around this. There is a great deal of information we want to talk about today. We hope we can exchange on some big picture issues. We're going to talk about the trends, talk about the risk landscape that we're seeing, how organizations are preparing, both the NGOs and the UN, to respond to this, what happens in the first 72 hours of an incident, and how we support families and colleagues and their staff after an incident and long into the aftercare. What training may support, and what is the role of member states, and how we as a sector can expand our knowledge and learn from each other and probably from many of you in the room. The session's being recorded and it's online, and we have lots of online participants, which is great. So just bear that in mind when we're having our conversation today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. I might start with William Blanchard. William Blanchard is the Director of Field Operations for UN Department of Safety and Security. UNDSS also co-chair the UN Hostage Incident Management Expert Advisory Committee. So it's an important body for this conversation. So welcome, Bill. I also have the honor to introduce Anseline Oconta. She is the Director for Security and Safety and Humanitarian Access for Action Against Hunger France. Welcome, Anne. We have Mohammed Sohail Ali online. Thank you, Mohammed, for joining us from New York. He is the Chief of the UN Department of Safety and Security Critical Incident Stress Management Section. And we also have Paul Farrell, the Director of Security for UNICEF and co-chair of the UN Hostage Incident Management Expert Advisory Committee. He's also a lead trainer on the UN training for hostage incident management as well. So welcome, Paul. So I might start my first question to Anseline. So Anseline, how does hostage taking link to the overall evolution of the global security environment and the current context in which humanitarians and our operations are working?
Yeah, just to set a bit the scene, it's not a surprise to anyone, I guess, to say that the current context of work for aid workers is not getting better. So that's just really the bottom line. And and speaking about hostage taking, kidnappings, it's one modality of violence that aid workers are victim of. And it reflects, I think, a global erosion currently that we can observe of the international humanitarian laws, the lack of accountability, also that we can observe a bit more generally. And starting with maybe just figures, as we speak about kidnappings, we see that the aid worker database, they are gathering this kind of information. They showed that they gathered 125 incidents of kidnapping in 2024, 112 for 2025. So that's not something that is, that's a current kind of incident that we can observe. And there are many drivers that are behind that explain this type of incidents. And we see that there are some more fragmented conflicts. We see also more states and non-state actors that are involved in conflicts and with this lack of accountability that comes with it. We see also in many contexts an increase criminality, like the criminality is rising, and also the information that are circulating online. So we see also increased disinformation, misinformation that also can explain that targeting aid workers can somehow be justified with some narrative that can be seen online. And this deterioration of the global context, it comes at a time we know all that there is a crisis also regarding the funding of humanitarian aid. So meaning also sometimes higher exposure of the humanitarian workers on the field, as downsizing teams, closing programs. It can deteriorate globally the global security context where we are working. Also, we can see deprioritization of funding for security management position or like a security management measure. So that's a whole context that is really not so positive at the moment, when at the same time we see the needs that are increasing. So that's it's really the paradox with more to do with less. I think generally we see the number of kidnapping, hostage taking that is constant or increasing. So it's linked with this global context we are working in now.
Space is getting smaller and smaller, and our risks are getting more prevalent, which isn't a good start for the conversation in terms of trends. I want to turn to you, Bill. Could you give us a brief overview of the issue of hostage taking of humanitarian workers, and what are the trends and the risk landscape that UNDSS is seeing?
Thank you. And in a way, I'm reflecting some of the same points, but I mean, we see hostage taking remains a significant issue across a large number of countries. We see the particularly high-risk countries such as Haiti, Mali, Somalia, and then Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sudan, and Cameroon. But it goes much wider than that. It's largely driven by economic motives, and it's carried out by criminal, armed, and insurgent groups, and often in weak governance or conflict affected areas. I would say it's a rare month when we don't have one or two UN incidents. Now, as I said, most are motivated by financial gain, so they're kidnapped for ransom. Sometimes opportunistic, sometimes supported by local networks, and the demands tend to be, in the majority of cases, directed at the families rather than at institutions. And the perpetrators range from organized criminal groups to politically aligned armed actors, and often, as I said, with unstable environments or even cross-border networks. The data that we've collected from a decade of watching this showed that about 85% of the financial demands were made directly to families. We also found that one of the risk factors was non-compliance with security measures. So we have as the UN a lot of security measures. It's hard to ensure compliance, but it is one of the risk factors is where compliance was low. A very high proportion of those cases are safely released, like 99%. But every single incident represents trauma, operational strain, reputational risk, and the trauma is not just to the person who's kidnapped, it's for the families who have dealt with that. So it's very important that we've got Sohail with us to talk about the psychosocial aspects. And so the main points, it's mainly economically driven, families are the main pressure point, and prevention gaps, particularly around compliance with security measures, remain a significant issue for us. And that's why when we reviewed the policy recently, we moved from a reactive, responding to an incident, which is vital, to a broader strategy that also has a preventive element, proactive risk management.
I think this is really helpful to kind of have this conversation from incident management to risk management. So Paul, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more on this. Why did the UN change this focus, and what's the significance?
Yeah, thank you. And I obviously going to piggyback on Bill's intervention, right? So if most of you signed up for this event are thinking of hostage taking as a response, right? We do safe training, we do heat training for staff, how to survive being taken as a hostage. And we often speak of it as a response. The hostage negotiation is the way people envision it. But we realize, as Bill hinted at, that this focus of response only was creating other issues. And I think I want to make double emphasize here again is the impact of these incidents. We started seeing and understanding really what the impact was on the hostages, on their loved ones, their family members, their friends, their colleagues. So we have an expression to keep us focused here, which is there is no good end to a hostage case, only a less bad end. This means that as soon as the hostage case starts, people are traumatized. So our interventions after it's happened can only make it less bad, but it's still going to be bad. All hostages and all their families are traumatized in all cases, even the shortest incident. So that's why we can only help make it less bad, but we can never make it good. And that's important to keep us in mind. That's why we have this expression. Of course, other impacts as well. There's disruption on programs, there's cost implications on the response itself, there's impact on reputation, etc. And so, and finally, what Bill noted was our realization on the non-compliance issue, right? So that's why we saw this now as an opportunity to really think about prevention, not getting taken in the first place. That is where all the most cost-effective efforts can be put, because that is really where we need to think. And by saying that, prevention implies it's not its response, but also prevention. That's why we call it risk management. So it's prevention and mitigation, and we want to do both, and we really want to emphasize prevention. I think this is very important. So what does this mean in the UN? And what would it mean in any organization with employees, right? This means the organization must commit to investing in security risk management that is meant to lower the likelihood of hostage-taking incidents occurring. We must engage with staff to get them engaged in their active involvement with their own security, right? And not passive consumers of security. We mentioned this in a previous panel. And as required, the organization, the employer, must use its authority as an employer to control the behavior of its staff, aka compliance. But it's more than just compliance, it's engagement and investment as well. So no organization, anyone here is in this meeting who belongs to an organization who's facing a hostage threat should think only about response. You need to think about prevention and investing in prevention. It's a very, very important because of the reasons we mentioned. So this just leaves one last point I want to just put on the table, and we'll see when it comes up in the rest of this panel. But it speaks to the concept of risk controls. If we're going to do risk management, someone needs to control, right? And one principle of risk management is we never assume control of something we don't manage, or we never assume risk for something we don't control. Sorry to correct myself. So the question is, who's best placed to control for this risk? And often it's the employer. And so therefore, this has implications for how we work with partners. We can support a partner in a resolution of a case, but we need to be clear who is responsible for prevention, because if we wait till response, it's too late and we're not managing risk properly. So let's think of that, who controls, not just later when we talk about who manages the actual response, but who controls the risk controls, and they're the ones best placed to manage this risk. Back to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Paul. And I think that's an important sentiment, that there's no good end to a hostage case, just a less bad potential end. So I think we need to keep that in the conversation today. And Celine, noting that Paul's talked about prevention preparedness, from an NGO perspective, how do organizations ensure preparedness for hostage-taking risks and potential hostage-taking incidents?
Yeah, first I just want to say we, like UN and the NGO management of security, as Paul said, like we, as employer anyway, we have all the same responsibilities, and that's important to make everyone responsible inside its own organization about its security, and have also management really involved and this control can be a bit complicated to do, or not the thing that we prefer to do, but it's necessary indeed. But when going to, and I think speaking for all NGOs, it's a bit difficult. We have it's an heterogeneous word. We have a different kind of ways of doing. But I think every organization, when it comes to security management, will have a discussion at its governance level regarding its risk appetite, and I think that's the first thing needs to be done for any organization, for any NGO, to identify, okay, what are we doing in this context? Is it worth taking this level of risks? So we know that a risk of kidnapping are generally, or it will depend from one context to another, but they are relatively low in terms of probability, but with so much impact. So after, every organization first needs to decide what they are doing. Is it worth the level of risk they are facing in general, and the risk of kidnapping especially? And I think after there are like three components that globally, like at the global level in an organization, that needs to be in place. So first, it's about the information of the staff, because even if the organization decides it's okay to go to this to one area with this level of risks, every individual needs to know if it's okay for him or her to go and take this risk. So everything related to informed consent will be really important. So to have, and when it comes to kidnapping, like I know for Action Against Hunger, we have a specific briefing for people working in an environment where the risk of kidnapping is present, where we explain, it comes first with everyday security management and personal responsibility in security management. Then what to do in case there is a kidnapping, what to do during detention, what would ACF do if there is a kidnapping while you are in detention, what about behavior during the release, what will we do after there is a release. So this information, like it's staff, all the employees need working in this environment needs to have it. And then I think it comes with a process of proof of life also to make sure we can identify if people are taken, so to be able to identify them. Then what Paul already mentioned about trainings, I think that's also an important component, because to have personal security trainings for the staff is it's like HIT type of training. With simulation for people to understand what it is to face some acute incidents, even if they are in a secure environment. But to have this first to know themselves under stress will be very important. Just the limit on that is that I think the sector we need to really scale up the number of the type of training that we are providing for our teams. Maybe also the last, first component information, second is preparation of staff in case it happens, what to do, how to avoid it to happen also. And then the last thing at an organizational level is to have a capacity to manage, so the incident management component and the redress as well. What can we do after also to try to correct the situation, even if we know that once someone is kidnapped, nothing will really make it will give back the time, will give back everything that happened during a detention. But so that's what is for me important to have in place at global level. And then it will be context by context. We have of course all the prevention measures that we put in place depending of the situation locally. And then regarding kidnapping risk, we'll have two different situations when we know that being an NGO is kind of a protection, so we'll go and work on our acceptance. There was an earlier panel on is acceptance dead, and I think like to work, for instance, on prevention of kidnapping risk when NGOs are recognized for their work. So we need to invest on acceptance and doing good work, communicating with everyone, etc., having high visibility. After we know also we have some situation where this will not be enough, that humanitarian workers can be a target, identified as legitimate targets. So here it will be a different kind of management with if we know that's one area, like we cannot take a road. So what are the options? Today we have, for instance, UNAS flight that allow us to reach some remote areas that we would not be able to reach by road. So that's very important to have this capacity. And otherwise it means sometimes to choose not to go to an area. So it means a community that will not receive humanitarian support. So I think that's what we can do, or what most of NGOs are doing, I think, to prepare, even if we can't really, as you all mentioned, we can't really be prepared for kidnapping, but we can reduce as much as possible the likelihood. We can make sure the teams know how to react and what will happen if they are kidnapped, like from their point of perspective, and also how the organization will manage the situation. That I think is very important.
I think this is just another example of how poor security can create an access challenge. And you gave a really good example of not being able to reach a community. Bill, from your side, I'm interested to hear, and I think the audience would probably benefit from a conversation on the UN's policy and the UN's approach for hostage incident management. What are the core principles and what guides our preparedness and our response as an organization?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm very happy to explain a bit of that. So what are the key elements of our approach? Well, the first thing is we define hostage taking as a seizure of individuals to compel action for extortion from a third party. And in that context, our overriding objective is clear. It's to get the safe and timely release of personnel within some strict policy parameters. We in UNDSS have the overall lead for hostage incident management and the overall lead on the response, working with whichever UN agency or department is affected. And we're about to put a bit more resource into our HM team precisely because the demand is high and there's a real need to support the system with it. So the non-negotiable principles guiding the UN response are no ransom payment from the UN, direct or indirect, no substantial concessions, no requests for member states to facilitate concessions. This is to avoid incentivizing future targeting and to preserve UN neutrality. There's a strategic logic in this. Paying ransoms increase market value. They incentivize future targeting of UN staff. And so our priority is to save life, whilst also increasing or reducing the long-term risk to other staff members. The second principle is the importance of the family. And this is not just because in a very high proportion of cases, the ransom demands are directed at the family. It's because the family are a victim as well here. I mean, it's horrible being kidnapped. It's horrible being a family member of somebody who's been kidnapped. And so we provide the support we can confidentially to families, providing psychological support. We'll hear more about that. Administrative, technical support. Confidentiality is key. Confidentiality of who is doing what is very important, and it's important where possible to give the families and let the families have some agency in how they manage the incident. So the overall aim as we engage or oversee a response or support a response is to establish some kind of, or to regain a bit of control. At the moment of kidnap, the hostage takers have control. They know what they are. They know what they want, and we know nothing. We may not know who did it, or even where it happened, or where the people are, or what the demands are. And by engaging, we may get some control back. We may get some understanding of it. We try and limit external interference. We try and protect confidentiality, and we try and identify stakeholders who might be able to influence the hostage takers or the environment in which they're making decisions. And then we try and use engagement strategies which are legal and principled. We do this mainly for UN Security Management System staff. That's the UN staff. In exceptional cases, with the authorization from my Under-Secretary General, we can extend support to non-UN SMS personnel under specific conditions. That could be a request from member states or from an employer of organizations who've been working closely with the UN. The overarching objective in all this is to protect lives, to reduce incentives for hostage taking, to uphold the UN's neutrality, and to prevent the UN and its staff from becoming high-value targets.
It's important that we set out our boundaries on our policy as well. I think it's really helpful for other organizations to understand why and also learn from us what the expectations are. And I certainly know for staff, it's very helpful before deploying to an operation to know the boundaries. Before we turn to hostage incident management and how we manage incidents in the sector, I'd like to ask a specific question on local staff. In most contexts, national staff or local staff from that country disproportionately are affected by security incidents in general. Is that the same for hostage incidents, and how could organizations address this imbalance?
Yeah, it's the same regarding hostage taking, with national being more victim of this type of incident. It's also a mechanical reason is that we have more local national staff than international. Often also the reason behind might be different, and the stakes then will be different as well. But in terms of how we in terms of prevention, it's I think it's important not to make any difference anyway between the type of staff that we are having. So national staff need to have equal level of information, equal level of preparation of training, equal level of psychological support, legal counsel, all these aspects. I think that's being in prevention during an incident and after, like the management and the treatment of staff is the same. But still, we need to also to understand the specificities of the different type of profiles of exposure to risks. So it's for like a bit every type of profile. We need to have a security management system that is that takes into account this different type of vulnerability. So it's also to understand maybe a national staff in one area will be more sensitive, can be more targeted than an expatriate in another area. So we need to adapt also our management system to that. I think also we need to make sure that there are local capacities to, inside our teams on the field, to manage critical incidents, and especially for kidnapping. We know that the first 24, 72 hours are really important. So there are global protocols of crisis management, but for I think kidnapping, there are specific ones that need to be in place. And of course, the management here of the situation might be different between an international than with a national, because we don't want. There can be a way not to raise the stakes too high from the kidnapper perspective. So it's not that the importance of every staff is the same, but the management might be slightly different to be for the good of the person who is victim of the kidnapping, to try to get the best outcome and the fastest outcome as possible. And I think also, that's important to strengthen or to emphasize on the need to just consider all aid workers being the same. They need the same level of protection. So I think that's important to have that in mind as well.
I think it's particularly important, certainly for my organization, that we look at these individual profiles, their vulnerabilities, and how that might shift their individual risk in a context. So certainly for us, that's particularly a priority. You mentioned about incident management and the first couple of hours. So I want to turn to you, Paul, at UNICEF. What are the essential components of effective hostage incident management?
Yeah, thanks. And of course, I'm speaking on behalf of the whole UN as we all work together on this, as Bill said, with TSS in the lead. So as Bill already highlighted, when an incident starts, hostage takers hold all the cards and they have all the control. And their efforts from that point onwards will be to retain this control until they get what they want. And as part of that strategy, to create as much fear and uncertainty in those they're extorting to ensure that they achieve that goal. That's how they're going to start off, right? So an organization responding needs to regain control. And in order to do that and to resolve the case, right, in the best interest of the hostage, I'm going to present to you what I think other organizations can learn from. That's the point of this session, right? We will present that there are three essential elements that are needed to resolve a case. Big picture elements. Number one is information. And Cecile already hinted at it, right? Number one is critical, cannot be resolved without it. What do we need to know to find our way out of this from their control to our control? What do we need to know? Where do we get this information? And how do we organize and analyze this information for decision making? That is key. And it doesn't matter what organization it is, you cannot resolve the case without it. Number 2 point, after information, number 2, communication. How can we communicate extremely effectively, and not effectively, extremely effectively, to gather information that we need, right, as above, and to influence either the hostage takers or stakeholders or whatever. This communication is central. And if we don't have prepared and trained communication, it will not be resolved. And third is proper structure. What response structures are needed within your organization to ensure the best information gathering and analysis and the best communication? Proper structure must be clear on one thing for sure: who makes decisions and at what level, and who does not make decisions. If we don't have that clear, there's no resolution to the case. In the UN, we use what's called a task force model. So a hostage incident cannot be resolved by non-experts. And as Asil already hinted at, regular crisis management team structures are not sufficient. So what the UN task force is, it's a task force of experts solely focused on resolving the case. And it includes a team close to the problem, but also headquarters support. And this front and back end are in all cases. So each of these 3 components work together, requires a lot more detail on how these 3 work, and we can't get into the detail here in this session, but that's the rough idea of what is needed, the minimum conditions for success. Now I mentioned influencing and stakeholders. So stakeholder management is the number 1 issue after the structure, the information, and the communication, because it crosses all 3 of those variables. And one, as Bill's already hinted at, and Sohail's going to get back to, one of the key stakeholders is the family, and that's why we spend so much effort in supporting them. These 3 components, information, communication, structure, will not resolve a case without people trained, right? We need to have people who are trained and have an expertise in this area. And finally, just by way of a general idea as why DSS is always in the lead, right, is that despite the normal decentralization approach for security management, in hostage incident management, we consider every case a global case. It is never only managed locally. That's why there's a task force. Why? Because as Bill mentioned, the implications for future hostage taking in other places. And the way the modern technology works, there's nothing happening in one country that someone doesn't know in another country. So our action in one place has implications globally, and all hostage cases are global. Back to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Paul. And I think this is a very important point on, especially in this day and age with technology, on information and communication and the structure, but also that what happens in one country may influence our operations, our security mismanagement posture in another country, and a case in another country. You touched on stakeholder management and families. And I want to turn to Bill and Sohail, thank you, Sohail, to talk about what the UN has done to kind of change the way we work with families and to put families really in the center of a hostage incident response.
Yeah, so as I said, a high proportion of incidents are directed at the families, and the UN recognizes that families are victims as well as the individual who's been captured. And our support includes psychological assistance, administrative guidance, technical advice, and confidentiality. But it's important that families they can have agency, and they may want to manage the case themselves. And in those cases, we'll support with advice if requested, while not crossing our red lines, which is no direct UN contact with hostage takers and no association of the UN with any payment. Perhaps most importantly, we'll always provide, regardless of who's acting, we will always provide psychosocial support. And I'd like Sohail to have a chance to explain that.
Over to you, Sohail.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've had the opportunity of, observing the evolution of hostage incident preparedness and management in the UN over the last 20 years. And we've learned a lot over that period. The General Assembly was very forward-looking in setting up a special team in UNDSS, the Critical Incident Stress Management section, which has expertise and specialists in trauma management. So that was very forward-looking of the General Assembly in 2001. The evolution of our relationship as an organization with the families of staff who are taken hostage has morphed over the years. Initially, they would be considered as stakeholders that need to be managed so that they don't do anything that can hinder or inadvertently, jeopardize the negotiations. Then there was a realization that they're also victims of extortion, and they require support in their own role as well. And then we learned over the years that they are not only victims, they are also empowered but traumatized partners that have a say, they have agency, they are impacted, but they also are able to support the hostage incident management process. They're able to contribute to it. Their decisions are important. And like Bill mentioned, most of the demands come to them. So the families are now considered as empowered but traumatized partners that are, with us in this process of getting the common goal of the quickest and safest release of their loved ones. And the family support that is required is so multidimensional and so complex. And I'll give you just a practical example. And it's from no particular location. But when a staff member was taken hostage, immediately the elderly parent ended up in hospital because of an aggravation of their heart condition. And the children couldn't go to school anymore because they were being scrutinized by the community, which found out that, their parent had been taken hostage or kidnapped or was missing. And the spouse was immediately thrown into a situation where her decisions could mean life or death for her partner, for her spouse. So the whole family is thrown into disarray. And the longer the hostage incident progresses, the more of a roller coaster it is for them. For us, it can be one issue that we manage every day, but for the family, it's something they manage every minute. And they have agency and they are traumatized and they need to be supported. So in the UN, in our current hostage incident risk management policy, we have two functions that are dedicated to supporting the family. One is the family liaison officer function, who deals with the practical aspects, the logistical aspects of supporting the family, the informational aspects, the media management aspects. And then you have the stress counselor, who deals with the psychosocial and mental health support for the families as they go through this roller coaster of, of challenges. And since most of the demands come to them, they need to be guided, supported, and advised. And sometimes the approach changes. In some situations, especially at the of the hostage incident, it's a centered approach. They're not sure, it's never possible to be completely ready for a family for a situation like this. So there's that initial phase where there's trauma, there's horror, there's desperation, where they require support, they're a victim. But then as they regain, their capacity, their agency, we change our approach to a survivor-centered approach, which is an empowered approach, where the family is a partner in decision-making they have a say in what would be best for their loved ones. And as it goes longer, we have to switch between these two different approaches, depending on how the incident is progressing. If it's going well, it's encouraged, the family feels empowered, and then they have setbacks, and they receive a call saying, if you don't pay up by tomorrow, get ready to pick up the body. And that throws the whole family into disarray at that time. So that victim-centered approach and the survivor-centered approach is a dynamic spectrum which we utilize to support the families as they go through this. And I will just leave you with one practical example that highlights the extent to which this can go. Like I remember an elderly father who was being told by his community that, is your house more important than your son? Why don't you sell your house and get your son back? And if you're resisting to sell your house, does it mean your son's life is not important for you? In a culture where guilt is so deep, I still can't forget that father's face. Was he making a decision that could jeopardize the life of his son? Or when a teenage girl was kidnapped and the parents were worried that we want her safe, but we're also very fearful that she may be sexually abused while she's in captivity. So that is the level of impact. That's the level of support that is required for the families. And it's a wide spectrum of specialized services that are required to support a family going through a situation. I know we will have more time to talk about the psychosocial support elements, but I just wanted to lay out the framework that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sohail. And I think it's really important for everyone here and online to hear this real human aspect and some of the examples that you've given us. I think it grounds us in the reality of cases. Just to say, we will have time for Q&A. So if you have a question, think of it. We'll get to it, and those online, please put them in the Q&A function as we go, and we will turn to these soon. I'd like to just remind the panelists, let's try and keep our remarks as concise as we can so we can allow some time for questions. Sohail talked about incident management and the trauma that it causes on individuals, Paul. In the first 72 hours of a hostage incident, we know that this time is critical. And often this is where we see in a lessons learned exercise that mistakes are made. What do organizations need to have in place before an incident occurs for them to act well within that 72-hour window?
Thanks, Bridget. I promise I will not take 72 hours to answer the question. Indeed, the first 72 hours are critical, and the mistakes can be fatal, 100%. So each organization, any organization, needs to be clear before an incident what their policy is and what their response will be. And so, they hinted at this, right? Because even though every case is different and complex, there are general principles that the organization needs to make sure they're clear beforehand. And waiting till it happens is too late. And that's why a lot of preparation is needed, a principled policy approach. And based on the three components that I gave earlier, the most important issue in the first 72 hours is information gathering and confidentiality on that information. And we'll talk later a bit more about that. So this information needs to be accurate and stored in a way that can be easily accessed for analysis and decision making. And losing information is one of the first big mistakes that can happen. Different people reporting to different people, not having one common picture. And that's why the UN, the task force approach really helps, because it's one clearinghouse for this information, even from the beginning. Then the organization needs to launch its structure, and needs to be clear beforehand what that structure was going to be. And once again, the most important thing in that is who is managing the case and making decisions. That has to be clear from the beginning. You're better off with imperfect information with clear decisions than everyone making decisions. It doesn't work. And finally, in the first 72 hours, there's something else that all organizations need to think about. a case just occurred. What is the risk to others? Is this a new event? Do we need to share this information? So in the UN, we have a requirement for the designated official and the security management team to focus on that. Do we need something, a warning? Do we need to change anything? Because now this happened, what is the implication for other potential hostages? So for me, that is the most important thing in the first 72 hours. Information, confidentiality, launch the structure, key on decision makers, and who else could be at risk. Back to you.
Thank you. And so, Hal, I'd like you to touch on a little bit on the psychosocial side. So you talked about the importance of families and support for people who go through incidents, they're hostages themselves, but also the staff. So what does this kind of support look like in practice?
Well, it's multidimensional, and it is required for all groups that are involved. So the psychosocial support is not only for the family and then for the hostage after the release, but also for the colleagues who need to continue working in that same operational environment with the same level of risk. Also for the hostage incident management team, which is making those decisions and going through that roller coaster where, their decisions could impact life or death of the staff who has been kidnapped, the family members, and also for the managers and leaders who have a double burden of, on one hand, supporting their teams who are experiencing this, but also on the other hand, the continuity of operations and mandate delivery, which is a very difficult balance to maintain. All these different partners need to be supported, and psychosocial support is then geared towards all of them. And for each partner, the requirements may be different. The leaders may need individual support when they're trying to make those decisions and supporting their team. The hostage incident management team, I remember being deployed with a team for months at end. Sometimes for weeks, nothing may happen. And you are frustrated. And then suddenly something happens and you get a message of, either doom or good news. And each interaction can change the course. So the burden of accountability is heavy on the shoulders of the hostage incident management team, as well as the family. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting for them. And they need to be helped and supported during that. And of course, the family needs to be supported, like I mentioned already. And once the person is released, that individual needs to be supported for as long as required, because the organizations do have a commitment to a duty of care. And we will, if we get a chance, we will talk about the long-term support that is required. So all that is managed through dedicated stress counselors we have in DSS, but also staff counselors we have in the agencies, funds, and programs who are specially trained for managing trauma and for managing hostage incident cases. So there's a whole community of specialists in the UN that are trained and ready to support these cases because of the fact that we have so many of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Sohail. And as someone we recently conducted a lessons learned on a hostage incident that we faced last year, and even that itself was a pretty stressful and burdensome process, and a lot of stress on the reviewers. I think we touched on stakeholder management, but I know that we had a number of member states register for this event online and in person. So I'd like to talk a little bit about stakeholder relationships in member states and how member states are involved in hostage situations. So Bill, how do organizations manage stakeholder relationships with member states? And what are those risks when the relationships are not managed proactively?
So the first thing to say is member states are always affected when their nationals are kidnapped. And we've heard that most often it's a national or local staff who has been kidnapped. So it's the host country in many cases, which is involved through the nationality of the person who's been kidnapped. They're also involved because they're responsible for the criminal process. a crime has been committed, and they're responsible for crime prevention and prosecution. So in those cases, we need contact, we need clarity on who's doing what, we need to know what the rules are, and that needs to be established clearly, ideally in advance. We know we have a relationship with the relevant bit of the local police, if it's the police, and we know who's going to do what. In the case of international staff, another member state will be affected, or if it's a kidnap of more than one people, it could well be several member states are affected. And it's public knowledge that there are a variety of approaches from member states. Some members are prepared to pay ransoms. Some member states have a strict policy of not doing so. Some have relevant intelligence capacities that might help us understand what's going on. And some even have hostage rescue capacities, although that's pretty limited. And it wouldn't be our first choice to go there. So an important question is, who is leading on the response? Just as we've said, within an organization, you've got to establish clearly, fast and early, who's going to be leading, who's going to be making decisions. You also need to do that with the member state affected. Is it the employer, i.e. the UN or an NGO, or is it the member state? If it's a group kidnap, are there multiple responses? And I think there are several principles here. One is, it's much preferable to have a single response than multiple responses. Multiple responses are confusing for the kidnappers. They run the risk of not understanding or thinking that one option is better than another, or jumping from one to the other when the situation gets difficult. And when they start losing control, they might go back to the one where they had more confidence. And we've seen that on occasion. If it's a UN employee, our preference is for the UN to be in the lead, because we have that duty of care. We understand the consequences for other UN staff in future, and because we have a well-established kidnap response, hostage incident management process. So that is our preference in general. But sometimes governments may take a different view, although normally we find that governments prefer to let the UN take the lead, so long as we keep them informed and share with them what we're doing, the principles we're taking, what we're trying to manage, and we listen, obviously, and engage with the partner. Any case, we need to engage and discuss and agree what's going to be done. Each case is individual, and the guiding principle for us is what is in the hostage's best interest. Over to you.
Paul, what about you? I mean, what would your message be for member states in the room, online? How can they best support humanitarian organizations with this?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm once again, I'm going to just piggyback on Bill and support him, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the most important thing is to resolve a case safely in the best interest of the hostage. We need to be clear who is in charge and who's making decisions, right? And as Bill hinted, all other efforts need to be coordinated with and in support of those center efforts. But there cannot be multiple. And so their question is then, well, how does that work, right? From the UN perspective, question of a government whose national is a staff member of the UN and taken hostage, the question I would give to member states, as Bill hinted at, was who's in best place to manage this and resolve the incident, right? And this is maybe different, as you mentioned, if it's a host government, right? But we're talking about a member state of an international who's taking somewhere. And even if we remove accountability and responsibility as an employer for our employees, I would say to member states, it's often not in their best interest to put their face on a case, because it raises the profile and has potentially complicated decision-making, including political variables. And that's why Bill noted many times, because of our robust processes, our clear task force, and our expertise, and because putting your face on it is not good, member states generally, and most of the time I've been involved, have always preferred the UN to be in the lead. And no matter what happens, there needs to be, as soon as the case is started, at least in the UN anyway, right? and engagement between the task force, the local and the headquarters, with the government involved at both levels. And it's meant to do two things: sharing information and coordinating action. This has to happen, and we can talk a bit more about information sharing after, but that's what's needed when it comes to member states, and hopefully that makes sense. If your national is taken for the UN anyway, this is the best way forward. It's going to resolve, and it's in the best interest of the hostage. Back to you, Virgil.
Thank you, Paul. And I know we've got some great questions in the chat, so we will come to them very soon. And I'm sure in the room people are burning. Anne-Celine, I wanted to talk to you about, as we move more into local community-based models, partnership models, how can we ensure that our partners, our local colleagues understand the risks that their staff face?
Yeah, I think when there is a risk of kidnapping, probably our partners know about it, but yeah, it's maybe a perception of what is acceptable risk that we need to talk about. And I think the general principle when working with partners, local partners, is to first make sure there is no risk transfer. So we are not doing a partnership for the wrong reason. So that's the first thing. Then I think it's all about dialogue with talking to each other to know how they work, how they perceive things, maybe exchanging about good practices that we might have, that they might have, and just to see if also there are gaps that we can identify together that they want to develop their capacities. And so I think it's a lot about exchanging and talking to each other about these good practices, making sure also they have some ways of managing critical incidents. So that's also one important topic. And it can be also about working on communication, how to have some, to make sure that the external communication doesn't attract more attention, also makes them vulnerable, and maybe be ready together on how to react to disinformation, misinformation, etc. So it's a lot of working together, trusting each other. And I think also what is important for local organization is to have the means to manage their own security. So that's for them to have their own budget for security management, to be able also to train their staff. And so for NGOs partnering with local organizations, it's important to include the staff from the partners in the training we might organize for our own staff. It can also be maybe find ways for the local organization to develop their own skills, their own ways of organizing personal security training. So things are more things we can develop together on that. And maybe one thing that might be more complicated for local organization when facing a kidnapping is it will, like for all organizations, when there is a kidnapping case, it's really overloading the organization as a whole. Or depending on the strength of the organization, but can be really destabilizing. They might not have also capacities for to support the staff after release or the families during. So maybe it's a good opportunity to speak about a mechanism that exists that's called the Protect Aid Worker mechanism that can support any kind of NGO or humanitarian worker that has faced an incident while working, and this mechanism can provide some financial support, some legal counsel as well, and so that's when organizations do not have the internal capacities, that's also one thing that is available, and that's interesting.
Thank you, Anne-Celine. And you touched on information sharing and learning off each other and best practices. Paul, the sensitivity of cases means we don't often share learning and information with others, right? It's just the nature of case management. The confidentiality component is understandable. We outlined why, but if the next organization in that place is likely to have the same hostage taking, or at least in the same context, doesn't it make sense that we share information, and how can we kind of navigate this together?
Yeah, thanks. I'll make a few points. I know we're conscious of time. Number one, I would submit the best way, and I would even say the only way to resolve a hostage case properly is three things. One, by the organization, and I say organization, responsible and best place to do so, that could be a family, it could be an employer, right? By that organization, number one, in a structured way based on the policies and the three components I gave earlier, and three, in secrecy. That has to happen, right? Nevertheless, to resolve a case, we need to share information, right? And that in order to gather and to get, and et cetera, right? So there is a confidentiality bubble within the resolution of the case. It's not like only one person knows something. So it depends on where that bubble extends to, is all in the best interest of resolving the case. And many times we share information with member states. It all depends on if it's part of a coordinated structure towards the resolution of the case. Nevertheless, after a case is over, this is where we're lacking, right? We need to find a way to share information, right? Of course, protecting key information. And I guess this is the point of this panel. This is why I was at least one person who wanted to have this in HNPW. So I would say this: secrecy is needed in management, but sharing is needed in learning. We just leave it at that. And I guess I'll just say that as we go to quick Q and answers, just remember, we need to be open on our learning here, but we can't say everything. But secrecy is needed for management, but sharing is needed for learning. Back to you.
That's good guidelines for as they come up with their questions. And final question for Sahel, and then we'll turn to Q&A. Sahel, the impact of the trauma of a hostage taking requires long-term support. This isn't a short-term support situation. What does that look like from your side?
Well, they say that, when framework meets the ground, it's often much more complex. So our framework is there, but the complexity, like Bill mentioned, where, for example, there may be multiple people taken hostage, including a mixture of different types of personnel, or there are personnel taken hostage and other personnel who are killed or injured at the same time, or there are people from different organizations taken hostage or kidnapped in the same event. So the complexity on the ground, and add to that the cultural component, the cultural context. In different cultures, the framework needs to be adjusted. So that complexity requires a lot of learning that Paul was mentioning about, because it's when the framework meets the ground here. In terms of long-term support, even after release, we've seen that immediately after release, about 22% of released personnel or family members, they exhibit signs of mental health problems. And even after 10 years, about 10% of people who have been released and 11% of family members still need psychological help. And the path can vary from complete recovery to partial recovery to long-term disability to challenges with reintegration in the community and the family, and often to retirement or leaving the organization. So, and CISMS manages the initial part, but then we transition the care to the agency or organization that had the staff member with their consent and the family's consent. The long-term care is taken by the organization that the staff member belonged to. And our effort and the collective effort is to find the path that has the best recovery. But in some cases, there may be long-term disability that may be required. So disability benefits need to be maintained, and they may need to leave the organization. They may need to be reassigned. They may need to be reintegrated gradually. Their work may need to be adjusted. So there needs to be a long-term commitment from the organization, which there is, but we need to implement it effectively and uniformly, that people who have gone through such a traumatic experience are supported as long as it is required for them to fully recover and be fully functional, and the families to be able to recover as well. And sometimes that can take up till 10 years or even longer. Thank you.
And no one person's journey is the same as each other, which is one thing I learned from a former hostage that supports us on women's security issues. I'd like to open to Q&A. So we might take firstly, if there's a question in the room first, and then I've got a number of questions online. So any questions in the room, and my colleague Yulin will come to you with a microphone. Fabulous. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself so we know who you are. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Beth Chapman. I'm Director of Risk Advisory at International Location Safety in the UK. So I work for an organisation that does heat training and crisis management training and hostage management focus. So I was really, really pleased to hear the emphasis from Bill and Paul and the whole panel about the focusing on prevention, planning, having good structures in place. I think that's so critical. One thing I wanted to get people's thoughts on is how can we enable more training for national and local staff? Because I completely, agree. We know that it overwhelmingly impacts national and local staff. One of the challenges we have is getting that funding, and providing at that level. So I just wanted to know examples of how we can maybe share learnings and do more of that at that level. Thank you.
Opening that up to the whole panel. Any takers? Paul's got his hand up very quickly. Over to you, Paul. I think you just briefly missed Bill.
Oh, Bill, go ahead. Please, Bill, go.
No, Paul, you go ahead.
That's so. Thanks for the question, Beth. What I think we need to distinguish, and I saw this one in the question in the comments, right? There's a difference between prevention and preparation. Because prevention is avoiding the incident, preparation is preparing to respond once the incident has occurred, right? And so we need to have that distinction in training as well. What training is focused on prevention and what training is focused on preparing to survive as a hostage? And so I would say for bang for our buck, as we mentioned in an earlier session on cost effectiveness, front-loading training on prevention is the most cost-effective use, and that is scalable for all staff, including local staff. So as part of the interagency coordination, we've developed prevention training, which can be done online. It's a webinar format. You can run 30 people, and you can do it in any language, and you can do it. So that's really the way to really make sure, one, we're addressing what really matters, which is prevention, and two, to really get to the people who need it the most, which is the ones most exposed and our local staff in the field. I hope that answers the question with some ideas, Anne. Beth, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, maybe just honestly, myself, regarding personal security training, the online thing, I will not, that's not something I believe too much into, but I think we have a problem of volume of means to train the national staff. And I see a way forward in training, like internalizing, like the capacities of training. We are trying to go into more training of trainers, to have local trainers who are autonomous and who can deliver the training. So that's the way we try to work, what we are working on at the moment. Yeah.
We might go to one of the questions online and then I'll come back to the room. We have a question online on when an international, just lost my power. Oh, back. When an international staff member is taken hostage and the hostage's home country becomes involved in the resolution process, how does the relationship with that country potentially influence the process? What leverage does the UN or NGOs have in facilitating a resolution compared to the home country of a hostage? Bill?
So it may vary. It does vary by country, and it does vary by organisation whose whose staff member has been taken hostage. As I said before, our strong preference in the UN is firstly to talk early and substantively about how the case is going to be handled, and our preference in the general case is that the UN should handle it when it's a UN staff member. Often that's also the preference of the country. Now, there are some cases where you might run into a conflict. It's quite rare. And even then, you want to be clear and resolve the conflict so that you're not doing parallel activity. It may be a little bit more difficult for NGOs to have that discussion. But I think in principle, the same issues arise would be my expectation. But Celine, you might have a view.
Yeah, after depends of the, as you said, the countries, nationalities, but I think also that's where the family has a role to play, also to say a bit what they want, who should take the lead. But in any case, there is a dialogue with the countries of origin of the person taken hostage.
Paul, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to extrapolate to to large organizations and somewhat less than we could have, right? So I think one of the things that we acknowledge in our training and our response is often you don't have control. What you have is influence. And so I would say, even as an NGO, start the dialogue on one of not what my leverage is, but where can I influence? And that, as Bill mentioned, is talk about a dialogue, right? So, and what is the main message? The main message for that influence is what is in the best interest of the hostage in resolving this case. And sometimes the family doesn't know what's in the best interest. They have no experience. And so this is why also an NGO, especially, needs to have some expertise, at least to engage in this discussion with a member state in an informed way. And if you don't have the expertise, then the member state thinks you have no capacity, and then there's no influence. So really, it's about having the ability to understand how this works, be able to engage intelligently in this influential discussion for what's in the best interest of the hostage.
Thank you, colleagues. I saw two more hands in the room. We might take both questions at the same time, and then I can open up to the panel. So I think Philippe.
Thanks very much. I'm Philippe Martou, Director of Security of the World Food Programme. Thanks very much for very interesting presentations and points. Are there any similarities between kidnapping incidents and detainee incidents? Because this is something which we are dealing with on a very, very regular basis. That would be my main question. Thanks.
Thank you, Philippe. And we'll take one more in the room. I know that's very similar to a question in the Q&A, which is great.
Thank you. Very much appreciate this, the panel. Kelly O'Donnell, I'm a consulting psychologist in the humanitarian and mission sector for a few years, 2 decades. Two quick questions. One is maybe for Sahel is, are there any specific like psychological techniques or approaches that the UN is gravitating towards to help with trauma-informed care, such as EMDR or cognitive behavioral therapy? And a corollary to that is what happens to the leaders, the case managers, the Pauls, the Bills, and people in the room? What kind of support do they need as they weather the ups and downs of this? Second question is, as we know, there's hundreds of thousands of NGO staff that are also affected, and 4 of the 5 panelists and moderator all represent large, relatively well-resourced, well-experienced UN agencies. But I'm wondering about the smaller guys, the smaller NGOs. Is there any type of a go-to sector-wide set of guidelines that incorporate the principles that you've been espousing to help orient NGOs to prepare and to plan and to provide good care and good management in critical incidents like this?
Thank you so much. And you're making us earn our money today. So really appreciate that. I think let's start with the first question on kidnapping versus detention and the difference. I saw Bill wanted to come in on this.
So unfortunately, we do face in the UN detention incidents. We have a very significant problem in North Yemen at the moment with more than 70 UN staff in detention. And I think there are some things that you can bring across from hostage incident management to detention management, but some important differences. So obviously, one is you've got stress and trauma all around. That's the same. It's for staff members, it's for family, it's for the individual. And so psychosocial support is needed. Another is that you need to be well organized and disciplined in handling it. We don't convene a hostage incident management task force in the same way, but nevertheless, some of the discipline about decision making and engagement is important. But an important difference is, firstly, that it would be very unusual for that to be a financially motivated case. So it is normally a case based on, well, actually, there's a wide range. It could be that the government concerned or the authority genuinely believes that the individuals have broken laws or done something bad. Or it could be that they're applying political pressure, or it could be a combination of those. And so there's just a much wider range of possible motivations on the other side of it. I think it's specifically hard for the UN because UN's first line of its security policy is security is the primary responsibility of the member state.